Hi folks, you're with Tacitus today, your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this audio live stream. Please listen to this presentation as you would a radio broadcast. In this essay, I'd like to talk about the concept of where the modern, the architecture, the groundwork for the modern bureaucratic deep state, where it came from. And there's been a few pieces around that I've seen on this, and one I think it was yesterday, that was done by Blaze TV. I think Glenn Beck was fronting it. I like Glenn's work, and I always make a point of watching it, and also the work of his colleagues, Stu and Sarah and so on. Now, what I'm paraphrasing here, Glenn suggested or implied, at least as I understand it, that Woodrow Wilson, the President of the United States during the First World War and before, and even going into after that, was really the architect of, or one of the primary shaker movers in setting up this bureaucracy, which became or morphed into what today we would see as the deep state. Now, I would take exception with some of that, and I think to understand it was simply, Wilson just there at the time that it all came together and happened. Was he the guy who made it happen? Was he a passenger to forces that were already in play? Would it have made a difference if there was a staunch Republican, I don't know, Teddy Roosevelt or someone else, or an independent in the case of Teddy Roosevelt? But if there was a staunch Republican there, would it have made a difference? Probably not, I would argue, because the forces in play and in train would have picked up and carried them along anybody who happened to be there. And there just happened to be Wilson at that time. So let's look at the times and let's look at what was going on and see how it fits in with this beginning of the bureaucratic deep state, or what later would become the bureaucratic deep state. Now, Wilson had to deal with World War One, and World War One, and America came in at the latter part of the war, but the British and the French, the Russians had just been defeated by the Germans. The British and the French were really struggling. They were, their military forces were less capable, less organised, less, their equipment wasn't as good. The Germans were certainly looking like they were going to win. And so when the Americans entered the war, this was a decisive entry that ended up tipping the balance. Not that the Germans were militarily defeated, but more that they'd exhausted their resources, and they really had nothing left that they, there was no more cookies left in the jar to fight the war with, whereas the Americans entering the war were not only financially underwriting the British and the French, but also were supplying large numbers of troops and equipment and so on. So in order to marshal the resources of the nation to fight the war, bureaucracies are always needed for those sorts of things, organizational bureaucracies, requisitioning of raw materials, giving factory orders to factories that otherwise may have made, say, motor vehicles or something else. They're now making military equipment. And the list goes on. So this was something where the government takes an active role. And of course, mass conscription means you got to do things like make uniforms and boots and goodness knows what. So this all involves government orders, government administration. Now, a lot of it stayed in private hands. The people that, like, say, Henry Ford and the motor vehicle company, they would put over part of their factory capacity into making military hardware. So it sort of kind of stayed in private hands. The reality was that the government was taking taxes from the people and then spending it on the war effort. Now, this requires and involves a bureaucracy, no matter who's doing it, whether Wilson was involved or someone else, it didn't matter. That was still going to involve bureaucracy. Now, once bureaucracies are created, it's very, very difficult to get rid of them. They supply lots of jobs. The better paid jobs at the apex of bureaucracy inevitably go to the friends of politicians and and various other influence peddlers. So when the need for the bureaucracy ends, for example, the war is over, when the needs for the bureaucracy end, then these people then go and lobby. Well, I don't want to lose my job. I got a nice cozy job here. I do fuck all and get paid shitloads of money. It's very prestigious. I get invited to balls and parties and all sorts of get to cut ribbons and so on. My wife loves it. We get to do overseas travel on the taxpayer's dime. Hey, my kids are and so on. So it's very hard to unravel for all sorts of reasons. Once the bureaucracy is in place, then it's going to be cronyistic, particularly at the top, and it's going to supply a lot of jobs for people. And no politician wants to say, "Hey, you 5,000 guys or 10,000 guys over there, you're now out of a job." That's not good political optics. And so any politician about to face an election go, "Oh, I don't want to do that," and so they leave the bureaucracy in place. And then it somehow gets bigger and just goes on and on. So that bureaucratic process in World War One was a product of the war. It was, I would argue, unavoidable. And should it have been dismembered after the war? Well, yeah, I guess, but again, for the reasons I've mentioned, all the politicians stacking the bureaucracy with all their buddies and the special pleadings they would have got. I remember in the party circuits and so on around Washington and elsewhere around there, every party you go to, every ball or function or anything at all, any entertainment you go to, cultural or otherwise, there's going to be the people there. They're going to be sitting right next to you, and they're the ones that are going to lose their jobs if you cut the bureaucracy. So it has an effect. It bleeds over into all sorts of other decision making. So that's number one. Number two is that the First World War was the first war ever in human history that was a mass industrial war. So that had never happened in human history for two reasons. Well, one is the mass industry just hadn't existed previously, or not during wartime. The last sort of major war that you could say happened in an industrial era that involved multiple countries was one hadn't really existed, like the Crimean War, I guess you could say, but even that was on a much lower level than the First World War was ever dreamed of being. So the First World War was the first mass industrial war. Now remember, before telephones and telegraphs and all this sort of thing, if you wanted to get a message to give directions or instructions or whatever to a general or someone with a small factory somewhere, it could take several days to get the communication across. Now we're in a situation with telephones where you can just pick up the telephone, call someone and talk to them, or they can get a communication via telegraph, as it was then. And they can get that sort of straight away. So communication was now a much different sort of arrangement. So because of mass industrial advanced industry, which only the Western countries had, by the way, and also advanced communications, telephones, which again only Western countries had, but also, and just as importantly, mass transport, the railways. The German rail network, for example, was such that they could transfer, hundreds of thousands of troops from one end of Germany to the other in a couple of days, and that was hitherto unimaginable. So, given the ability to mobilise people, mass mobilisation, mass industry, you have an industrial capacity. It's enough where you can equip millions of soldiers with rifles and bullets and boots and whatever else. That hitherto hadn't existed. Now, when you've got that amount of resources being mobilised and the mass industrial capacity and the ability to direct the resources of the nation for a particular geopolitical goal, winning a war, for example, then that again creates bureaucracy. But none of these things were possible without the industry, the communications, the population, and so on and so forth. So a whole lot of things came into play all at the same time, or very close to the same time, or if they had existed, say 10, 15 years previously, they weren't able to apply them. For example, if you look at, say, the rail network in the United States in the Civil War as a case in point, I mean, there was a rail network there, but the reality was that marching troops, for long distances all around the place, that was still the primary way of moving people around. Now, there were other things like the river boats in down the Mississippi and all this sort of thing, and there were there were rail lines, and the war did cause an increase in the amount of railway miles that were around, that sort of thing. But still, marching the troops up and down was how it all happened. This was changing as well, so that the administration around transport and so on, all of this required bureaucracies and lots of people and lots of government employed, flunkies and stooges and so on. So my sort of view on this was that whether you were looking at the United States and Wilson, or the United Kingdom with Prime Minister Asquith, or later Prime Minister Lloyd George, that this mass bureaucracy and mass mobilisation of resources and coordination by government was a byproduct of all these other forces that were in play and that were happening, and that it was an inevitable byproduct and outcome from that sort of again, those combined and converging forces. So whoever was there, I think, whether it be again President of the United States or President of France or Prime Minister of Britain, whoever was there was going to face and deal with and be carried along, importantly, carried along by those converging forces. Putting that aside for a moment, did the creation of the first ever creation of a mass bureaucracy, which was again a byproduct of mass industrial war, was that the beginning of what would later become a morph into the deep state? Well, it probably was, because there had never been mass bureaucracy previously, and without mass bureaucracy, you cannot, by definition, have a deep state. So was it, the beginnings of that in terms of the creation of a beast that would later on come to devour all those it was supposed to serve and assist? Well, yeah, I guess, but not for the reasons that I think Glenn and his team have put forward. You've been attached to us today, your Pushback channel. Thank you for listening.